Hi, welcome back to my movie recaps. Today, I'll introduce you to an action-packed fantasy adventure movie from 2009 called Daybreakers. Spoiler alert, the content contains plot details, so proceed with caution. In 2019, a young girl writes a letter describing how she can no longer bear the fact that she will never change or grow older. She leaves her home to witness the sunrise, and as she gazes upward, we see her golden eyes. She is a vampire, and as the sun rises, her entire body bursts into flames. The world by day is empty, ravaged by a plague originating from bats infected by a virus in 2009. Most of humanity has turned into vampires, and the human population has drastically declined. Researchers are frantically searching for a blood substitute to sustain the vampire race. A small resistance group fights for human rights, hunted and treated as mere livestock. When night falls, life resumes. Vampires carry on with their daily routines, much like humans once did, going to work, socializing, or relaxing. We see a homeless vampire begging for blood, threatening a passerby. The police promptly subdue him with a stun gun. Edward is a hematologist at Bromsley Marks, a leading blood supplier. As he passes through security gates, Edward walks by the grim machines at the human farm, a place he despises before arriving at his lab. He's working tirelessly on finding a blood substitute, but his latest experiment ends in failure. Soon after, Edward attends a meeting with his boss, Charles Bromley, alongside Christopher Caruso, a commissioner and a military officer. The commissioner reports on the latest experiment conducted on a death row inmate used to study the effects of blood deprivation. The lack of blood leads to a complete frontal lobe degeneration. The first sign? The inmate's ears grow long. He quickly transforms into a Nosferatu-like creature, devoid of reasoning and emotion. They refer to these creatures as subsiders, who are becoming a growing problem on the streets. With only 5% of the human population remaining, failure to find a substitute means everyone will eventually become a subsider. Bromley then pulls Edward aside to his private office, offering him a cup of blood coffee, which Edward declines. Bromley shares his story. He had cancer, but becoming a vampire cured him. However, his daughter refused to become a vampire and ran away. He knows Edward pities humans, just like he does, and insists they need to start testing the substitute on humans as soon as possible to save mankind. Back in the lab, Edward discusses the progress with Christopher, who hesitates, but confirms that the substitute has shown positive results on a monkey, signaling it's time for human trials. The researchers begin the experiment under Bromley's observation from behind a window, accompanied by a few officers. Edward slowly administers the substitute into a patient's bloodstream. At first, the patient feels fine, but as the full dose enters his system, he starts vomiting, convulsing, and breaking out in blisters. But a second later, his entire body explodes. That night, Edward leaves the office and drives home. As he scratches his ear, he senses something is off. He checks the rearview mirror camera and notices his ears beginning to elongate. This distraction almost causes him to miss an oncoming vehicle. At the last second, he swerves and stops, but the other car crashes into a fence. Edward steps out to help and gets hit by an arrow in the arm. Humans step out of the wrecked vehicle, led by Audrey Bennett holding a crossbow for protection against vampires. Suddenly, police sirens blare in the distance. Edward promises he means no harm and urges them to get into his car. After a brief hesitation, they agree. Edward activates the car's daylight protection mode, darkening all the windows. He pulls the arrow from his arm as the police arrive and lies about the direction the group fled. Audrey finds Edward's ID card, realizing his occupation. After the police leave, they step out of the car, and Audrey wishes Edward a happy birthday before they part ways. Edward returns home, greeted by a community announcement warning about the approaching dawn. Inside, he eats dinner and tends to his plants. Unexpectedly, his brother Frankie Dalton, a soldier who has been estranged from him for months, visits. Frankie teases him about not having a birthday celebration. Edward replies that he has turned 35 10 times over, but Frankie insists on celebrating and pulls out a bottle of 100% pure blood, an expensive rarity. When Edward refuses, Frankie gets angry and rehashes their old argument. Edward avoids drinking human blood but works for a company that exploits humans, considering it a necessary evil to find a substitute. Meanwhile, he despises Frankie for hunting humans for the military. But a subsider appears, blocking his way. The creature enters the kitchen and begins licking the blood off the wall and table. Frankie pulls a knife from the rack, startling the subsider, who slams him against the wall. Frankie crashes into a glass table, briefly losing consciousness. The subsider advances toward Edward, who pushes it back with a chair, shouting for his brother. Frankie regains consciousness, grabs the knife, and joins Edward in fighting the creature. But it climbs onto the ceiling. Frankie slashes at it several times before decapitating it. Police arrive, commenting on the increasing subsider sightings in the suburbs. One officer finds a ring on the creature, revealing it to be a local gardener. They also note self-inflicted wounds, indicating that subsiders are accelerating their transformation through self-consumption. The next morning, Edward is awakened by the security alarm. He switches on the lights and finds Audrey pointing a crossbow at him. She explains they are searching for trustworthy vampires and need his help to find an alternative to the blood substitute. She hands him a paper with a map. Edward is distracted by a noise and turns around, giving Audrey the chance to slip away unnoticed. Investigating the noise, he finds Frankie and brushes off his questions about the woman. Edward replied that there was nothing. Edward confronts his boss, asking whether the substitute can truly replace human blood. Bromley assures him that most people will be satisfied with it, though some will always demand the real thing. Edward reminds him that Bromley's daughter is among them. Returning to his lab, Edward stares at the map. At dawn, instead of going home, he equips his car with light protection and drives to the outskirts, where Audrey awaits. She directs him to approach a large tree. He parks in its shade, wearing a hat and sunglasses to avoid sunlight. There, he meets Lionel Elvis Cormac. Frankie arrives and aims a gun at Audrey. Edward tries to stop his brother, but Frankie won't listen as reinforcements arrive. Audrey pushes Frankie into the sunlight and escapes with the others in Edward's car. The soldiers fire at Lionel's car, destroying it. As they flee, the soldiers shoot at Edward's car, puncturing its light shield. Audrey tries to cover the holes with her hands, but more appear, and the rear camera is shot out, impairing Edward's view. Lionel takes over the wheel, using the gap in the shield to navigate. They cross an old bridge, but the military truck is too heavy, causing the bridge to collapse and the truck to explode. The remaining soldiers are stranded, unable to pursue. As night falls, the group rests by a river, where Lionel shares his story. He once worked on improving cars for daytime travel and ran one of the first stores in town. Driving during the day was exhilarating, with no one else around, but it was also dangerous. One day, weakened from lack of blood, Lionel accidentally crashed his car into the riverbank. Thrown from the vehicle, he caught fire but fell into the river. When he emerged, he had become human again. Lionel and Audrey want Edward to safely recreate these conditions. Meanwhile, at Bromley's company, Bromley looks at photos of his daughter. Frankie meets with him, earning praise for his report. Bromley offers to drop all charges if Edward returns immediately. Frankie agrees to do whatever Bromley asks. Back at the river, Edward and the group prepare to leave for a safe house. Edward can't help but stare at Audrey's neck. Noticing his behavior and his sharp ears, Audrey cuts her hand and pours her blood into a cup for him. Though reluctant at first, Edward drinks the blood to prove he can control himself around humans. So he accepted and drank the cup of blood. Hours later, they arrive at an old vineyard, where Edward meets other survivors, including Jarvis, who leads human rescue missions. Inside, Edward is introduced to Senator Wes Turner, a vampire politician advocating for human rights and seeking a cure. Meanwhile, at Bromley's lab, the researchers remove a body from the machine, having exhausted the human supply. At a subway station coffee stand, a man complains that his coffee doesn't contain enough blood. The barista explains that 5% is the legal limit she can serve. The man refuses to accept this and steals a blood pouch, spilling it everywhere, triggering a chaotic frenzy. People begin looting the blood, forcing the police to intervene with stun guns. The next morning at the vineyard, Edward draws Lionel's blood for testing and asks some question about how he felt the day became human. Audrey approaches Edward and tells him that, although they fear him, they still believe he can help. Edward notices the fermentation tanks, and after Audrey confirms they are airtight, they decide to inspect them. The tanks have air evacuation systems to extinguish fires, and Edward resolves to use them for his experiment. They begin making the necessary adjustments. Meanwhile, Jarvis's team is escorting a group of rescued humans, including Bromley's daughter, Alison, to the vineyard. A sudden impact damages one of their tires, forcing them to stop. As they exit the vehicle, weapons drawn, they are quickly surrounded and subdued by soldiers. Before losing consciousness, Alison manages to radio the vineyard. Frankie intercepts her radio and uses it to trace the vineyard's location. Back at the vineyard, everyone is preparing to leave with Turner to a safer location. But Edward insists on staying, saying this is their only chance to conduct the experiment. Lionel and Audrey decide to stay and help him. At Bromley's company, Alison wakes up in her father's office and grabs a knife as he enters. She begs him to save her friends, but Bromley is simply overjoyed to see her again. He embraces her and admits there's nothing he can do for her friends. Alison pushes him away and runs toward the door, but a guard knocks her unconscious. Bromley realizes she has stabbed him during her escape attempt. At dawn, the experiment is ready. Audrey will observe through a monitor, while Lionel stays inside the tank with Edward, who is fitted with a heart monitor and wrapped in a wet blanket. The process is simple. They open a hole in the tank to expose Edward to sunlight, then use the air evacuation system to extinguish the fire. The first two attempts fail, but the third succeeds when they let Edward burn a little longer. Edward transforms back into a human. Their celebration is cut short as soldiers storm the vineyard. They hide in a wine barrel to avoid capture. At Bromley's company, Frankie visits his wounded boss. Bromley instructs him to complete a task, and Frankie leaves to meet Alison in her holding cell. Though she resists becoming a vampire, Frankie bites her. Back at the vineyard, Edward and the group emerge from hiding, ensuring the area is clear. Edward steps into the sunlight and is amazed that it no longer burns his skin. Lionel finds his old car. Meanwhile, at the company, Bromley discovers that the human supply has run out, and Alison has refused to drink her rationed blood. Entering her cell, he finds Alison biting herself, accelerating her mutation. She attacks him, blaming him for everything, before being taken away. The military imposes martial law to combat the subsiders on the streets. Switching back to Edward's group, they arrive at Turner's cabin only to find everyone dead. Audrey begins to lose hope, but Edward assures her he knows someone who can help. Meanwhile, Christopher initiates a raid at the lab. Soldiers drag subsiders into the sunlight to execute them. Among them is Alison, and seeing her death fills Frankie with regret. That night, Christopher returns home to find Edward's group waiting for him. Edward announces that he has found a cure, one better than any substitute, and asks Christopher to help recreate the experiment. Their conversation is interrupted by a phone ringing. Christopher excuses himself to answer the call, but when he doesn't return, Audrey checks on him while Edward and Lionel inspect his ID. They realize Christopher left his phone line open during the call, alerting the company to their location. Suddenly, soldiers arrive, knocking Audrey unconscious and capturing her, while Lionel and Edward escape through underground tunnels. They take refuge in an old garage, where a subsider attacks them. Frankie appears and shoots the creature, then realizes his brother is human again. He admits he only turned Edward into a vampire to keep him from dying. Overwhelmed with guilt, Frankie offers to help, but as Lionel approaches, Frankie's bloodlust takes over, and he bites Lionel. Edward pushes Frankie off Lionel and prepares to shoot him, but he hesitates, noticing something. The scene shifts to Edward entering the company building, triggering the alarm with his human presence. He is captured and taken to Bromley's office, where Bromley is drinking blood from Audrey, who is slumped in a chair. Edward feigns regret, saying he wants to become a vampire again, much to Audrey's disappointment. Bromley reveals that they have perfected the blood substitute and mocks Edward as a coward for not turning his daughter himself. In a fit of rage, Bromley bites Edward, but this was part of Edward's plan all along. Bromley begins reverting to human form, and Edward explains that drinking the blood of a cured vampire is the true cure. Bromley triggers the alarm, summoning guards. As the soldiers arrive and open the elevator, they find Bromley tied to a chair, and the frenzied vampires descend upon him. Meanwhile, Audrey and Edward arm themselves with weapons from a supply room and prepare to leave the building, only to be blocked by soldiers. The glass shatters as Frankie crashes Lionel's car through the entrance, taking out the guards to save his brother. However, reinforcements arrive and the trio is surrounded. Frankie urges Edward to go ahead, sacrificing himself as the soldiers swarm and consume him. He pursues her to the security room, where, after a brief skirmish, he and Audrey take down 2 vampire soldiers and neutralize a third. Through the security cameras, they witness the soldiers who fed on Frankie transforming back into humans, triggering a conflict with the remaining vampires. As Edward and Audrey return to the lobby, only a few surviving humans remain. Christopher appears and shoots some of the soldiers, insisting that no cure is possible. Just as he aims at Edward and Audrey, a crossbow bolt strikes him in the chest. It's Lionel, arriving to assist. Audrey embraces Lionel, while Edward gazes at Frankie's lifeless body, the sunlight slowly filling the room. The film ends with the 3 of them driving away in Lionel's car. Edward declares that they've found the cure and can turn everyone back. It's not too late.